Hello, so welcome to the Evolving Language of Cockney online discussion, part of the Modern Cockney Festival. We're here today to explore the fascinating subject of Cockney, its story of its past, its present, and perhaps also its future. And we've got some fabulous free guest speakers we'll introduce you to shortly. So just to introduce myself, I'm Andy Green. I'm from a social enterprise called Grow Social Capital. And we do work to encourage people to and communities to make use of the fabulous asset, which is what's called social capital. And that is like the power within communities, relationships, and also critically shared social identities, of which Cockney is one. So that brought us here to the subject of exploring and celebrating a Cockney identity. And a year ago, we began a series of events called Cockney Conversations Month. And that's where I teamed up with a lovely guy, Saif. Would you want to introduce yourself, mate?
Yeah, thanks very much for coming today, everyone. My name's Saif Osmani. I live in the East End, and along with Andy, we set up the Cockney Cultures last year. We had Cockney Conversations Month, and that's morphed into the Modern Cockney Festival this year. We're really excited about celebrating local culture. In 2016, we set up the Bengali East End Heritage Society, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's in response to the East End Preservation Society and the Jewish East End Celebration Society. And we thought, well, hang on a minute. We've got a culture here as well, and we've got a localized culture, which is very distinctly different to other types of westernized Bengali or South Asian cultures. And we really wanted to celebrate that. And we've just kind of evolved from that, and we're going to see how it goes. So I'm really excited to be leading with Andy on the Cockney and all things Cockney this year, and hopefully in a few years' time, and hopefully it continues.
Yeah, so we're stepping stone. So today we'll welcome our guest speakers, and what I'd suggest I'll have a chat with them as we begin each of their sessions. So we've got three speakers today. Johnny Robinson from the British Library, very much exploring the story of the Cockney past and delving into the archives. A fascinating thing really is about the British Library. I was, like many people, presumed it's just full of books, but no, it's got full of amazing range of all forms of content in there, and Johnny will explain a bit more about that. And I say a friend of ours from last year's events, Dr. Joanna Gerwin, currently at the Queen Mary University, who's been doing a fabulous study, and do visit a website, and she's going to be telling you more about her program of London Talks, researching the London has spoken on the streets of London. And a fabulous writer here, Tony White, writer of several novels, including Foxy Tea, which celebrates his 20th anniversary, and also his new novel, Fountain in the Forest, which we'll be able to talk about a bit more shortly. So what I suggest do is get our event underway. But before we do that, I just want to have some background context. And this graph here is from a great tool called Google Ngram, and it shows usage of words in printed in text. So it's a good indicator of maybe the health and well-being or vibrancy of a word, an identity, a label. And really one of the key things we're challenging with the Modern Cockney Festival is a notion, a narrative that, quote, Cockney is dying, unquote. And really, as I say, you can see from the graph there that in the last part of the 20th century, the word Cockney enjoyed a 25% growth. So far from being a sort of dying thing, the very concept of Cockney very alive. There is some slight decline, which in last 3 or 4 years, which is mirrored across all regional British identities, a similar pattern with Ouija, Scouse and Geordie and so on. And so really what we're saying with the Modern Cockney Festival, we believe we need to make the idea of identities relevant, not just a nostalgic thing. And therefore, with the idea of Cockney showing that actually the idea and identity is very much alive. And you can see significant growth. Fascinating there that there's a massive peak in the 1820s. We've not come across any academic studies on this, but we believe, so I didn't really know about this until I started getting into the celebrating Cockney. What are known as the Cockney poets, significant group of poets at the time. You can see there like the impact on contemporary culture, that the actual peak of Cockneydom was in 1820. So, as I say, a fabulous record there to show both the backstory and some fascinating insights, but a critical message there that Cockney, is it far from dying? Interestingly, that concept of pearly king and queen, what perceived as an icon of traditional Cockney. And you see there, like significant, yes, some decline in recent years, but nonetheless a significant upward narrative there going forward. And even astonishingly, if you look at pie and mash online, right, it's a massive exponential growth. So as I say, really highlighting this point here that, is Cockney dying, or is the Cockney as an identity, alive and well, but maybe it needs to be better understood, which brings us into the top of our conversation. So I'm going to come off share now and introduce you to Johnny Robinson from the British Library. Johnny, I'm going to come off share. I'm going to quickly make you a co-host. Excuse me a second here. And Johnny, just want to tell us about your job. What do you do in your work at the British Library? Oh, sorry, Johnny. I mean, sorry, my apologies, Johnny. Saif, can you unmute Johnny for us while I? Slight technical one here.
So yeah, can you hear me now?
You can. My apologies, Johnny, mate. So
wonderful. Yeah. So I work at the British Library. I'm hoping I will be able to share screen. As I do so, hopefully I'll get a thumbs up that people can see a blue.
Yeah, it's coming through loud. Loud and clear.
Wonderful. So yes, I work in our sound archive. So I'm responsible for a wonderful set of sound recordings that go back, roughly speaking, 120 years or so. I'm conscious last year I joined you and played a few clips from the archive of our historic material, and I know you wanted to focus on the evolution of Cockney and whether it's dying, how it's changing, etc. And I'm sure the other speakers will talk to that. But I was just going to play some clips from our archives that are actually modern recordings, but show the differences between generations, if you like. So I will play a couple of clips. They're from what's called the Voice Bank. So we had an exhibition at the library about 10, 12 years ago that explored the evolution of the English language generally, but we had a wonderful set of exhibits on London English. And at the end of the exhibition, we encouraged visitors to record their voices. And one of the things we asked them to do, as you can see, we got 10,000 contributions to this collection. One of the things we asked them to do was record a reading passage, and we chose a children's book, Mr. Tickle, for a number of reasons, but principally because it's a very simple text and all ages and varieties of English could read it. But it also happens to contain a wonderful set of vowel variations and consonant variations. So I'm going to play this first clip and see what you think, whether you feel this is a sort of Cockney type voice. Just going to.
As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle. Looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinary long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeped in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at a desk and a teacher writing on a blackboard. Mr. Tickle waited a minute and then reached in through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinary long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned around very quickly to see who was there, but there was nobody there.
Okay, so we could pick out lots of features there. I'll come to that in a moment because I want to play some younger speakers. The key thing here is this is a speaker who told us he was born in East London in 1976. If we move forward in time, this is also a speaker from London. We're not sure exactly where in London. Is it Cockney or is it a sort of more mainstream London voice? Have a little listen, see what you think. But the key thing is she's a slightly younger speaker.
As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to school. There was nobody about, so reaching up his extraordinarily long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeped in through the open window. Inside, he couldn't see a classroom. He could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks, a teacher writing on a blackboard. Mr. Tickle waited a minute and then reached through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air, turned around very quickly to see who was there, but nobody was there.
Okay, so again, very clearly, iconically London sounding features. A younger speaker, interestingly, she did it in a different recording she made. She did herself use the term Cockney. She described herself as a Cockney. And then finally, this is a very interesting recording, a younger speaker. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term multicultural London English, this notion of a new variant of English emerging in London, particularly among younger speakers who've grown up in mixed ethnicities and mixed multicultural communities. This is a speaker who is an L1 Bengali speaker from North London. In other words, his mother tongue is Bengali.
As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about. So reaching up to his extraordinarily long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeped in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle waited a minute and then reached in through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned around very quickly to see who was there, but there was nobody there.
Okay, so hopefully you got a sense. I don't know how familiar all the audience are with London English, but they were all very clearly London speakers. If we pick out some features there, what I think is interesting is there are a few features that were consistent throughout the speakers. So the older speaker, the younger speaker, the female, the male, the speaker who we might describe as MLE with the other heritage language. So on all the occasions where there was a syllable final L, they vocalized the L. In other words, they used a vowel. So they said tickle, school, pulled, children. They were glottalizing their T's throughout. So sitting, waiting, writing. Only one of the speakers dropped an H. Now, if you look at traditional representations of Cockney or London English, you get a lot of H dropping for meat, meand, etc., etc. The Cockney speaker, as I've described in there, did drop his H, but the other two speakers didn't. The TH sounds, all three of them said through with a F sound, as in the word finger at the start. But the middle speaker used a kind of more mainstream canonical the sound in the words there, the, and there. The other two speakers used stop, so they said in the air with a sort of n, sort of half n, half d sound. Two speakers used a monophthong, so about or rand, or in one case about, rand, that kind of thing. But the middle speaker used an ow sound. The next set of vowels were really interesting. So the younger speaker, the MLE speaker, had that very modern ah sound. So as, wad, ha, inside, which is a monophthong, a very unusual vowel for traditional London English, but something you hear among younger speakers. Likewise, the two first speakers had a sort of very typical Cockney goat sound, open, window, whereas the younger speaker had a sort of window or window sound at one time. And then the other thing that I think is interesting, the older speaker said in the air. Now, in most accents of English, British English, we distinguish between the in front of a vowel and the in front of a consonant. So we say the book, but the animal. And that was true of traditional London English. So you got in the air, an E sound for the. But the two younger speakers said the air and the open window. So they use that vowel, which is common among younger speakers in a lot of accents, but certainly in London. So anyway, I'll stop sharing now. I hope you all heard those recordings, and they got a sense, as I say, of our archives showing change across time, not just through listening to older recordings, but if we listen to a single collection with a variety of voices, young, old, from different social backgrounds, we get a real sense of, you know, the huge variety in London English, be that Cockney English, London English, multicultural London English, whatever we want to call it. So our collections are available for the public to listen to. We have a website called sounds.bl.uk. You can hear those recordings and many, many more recordings at that website freely across the world. And we've got a huge number of collections that we're trying to clear for online access. So you can explore huge numbers of recordings of London English. Okay.
Johnny, on that point, I mean, I've learned some new words of glotterizing, is it, and monotones. I've never been into phonetics. I can't even pronounce it, but it just seems to me that there's a fabulous science and almost like architecture to how we speak in our language. What are some key factors that influence how people speak? Well, I mean, what's shaping those
Well,
different
obviously
people?
in our L1, as linguists call it, our first language, our mother tongue, whatever we want to call it, we are exposed to that as a baby, and it's generally our parents or carers who are the biggest influence on our pronunciation patterns. But certainly research shows as we get to the age where we go to school, and it's our peer group. So effectively all the people around you, you get input from the variety of speakers you hear. And of course, in most cases, as young people, we associate with family, friends, close communities. We go to school, and then that's the big influence. So all that's kind of all that contributes to the pronunciation people use. So if you stay in the same area all your life and you work in the local community, then inevitably your speech patterns will reflect very much your local area. For many speakers, particularly somebody like me, we move around throughout life. We go away to education, university, different jobs, etc. And we have other influences on us. But generally speaking, those early years, and particularly the teenage years, are where we formulate what eventually becomes our accent. And obviously people like Johanna, who research in this area much more thoroughly than me, will be able to talk very much about that as well.
What about the influence of, say, like mass media? So what people are hearing on the screens and the videos and content. What sort of impact? I mean, I'm particularly. I mean, now with the emergence of so much content online, and to me it seems to favour sort of underground alternative ways of speaking and so on. I mean, is that much of an impact? The mass media
Again,
and different media.
Inevitably, all these things have an impact on our language awareness and our language use. But generally speaking, and again, Johanna would talk to this better than me, we pick up the odd word. So vocabulary, we're influenced by the things we hear and see on media, and we might adopt a new word or whatever because it captures what we want to say. And obviously young people are very much influenced by social media in that way. And so there's lots of things like, new innovative comes in and out of the language very quickly. Some of it survives, some of it's just a point in time. Grammar changes much more slowly, and in terms of pronunciation, generally speaking, most research shows that the biggest influence is face-to-face communication. So again, the people we associate with. So we might change our pronunciation if we move geographically, or if we move into a different social circle, or all of us indeed speak differently depending on who we're talking to, what the purpose is. We might be talking to somebody at a football match in a completely different way than we would to a person we've never met in a job interview, sort of thing. But obviously all of us move within a certain range that is defined by our own personal identity. But yes, these things do have an impact. But I think in terms of pronunciation, the biggest impact is face-to-face communication and the people we associate with in the physical world, although the virtual world and the media and etc. does have some influence and impact.
Yeah. Now, you showed in the clips there was some evidence of, say, where like English may not be the mother tongue, the first language, and that may impact. But I'm just wondering, like in previous generations, so like London, the East End, and so on, has had waves of new people from different parts of the world coming. So we go back 120 years ago, there would have been a significant amount of Eastern European people arriving where English wasn't the first language. I'm just wondering, how long does the impact of having not English as your first language, and how much sort of typically do you find some sort of assimilation, but an evolution of the language away from that sort of input of the influence of the mother tongue there?
Yeah, well, obviously London is a wonderful case study for its evolution over a number of years, and huge migration from all parts of the world across time. I mean, I think what's interesting in the last 20, 30, 40 years is the huge numbers of speakers of other languages than English, and varieties of English from different parts of the world, British Caribbean communities, British Asian communities. Of course, these communities do have English, sometimes as a second language, sometimes bilingually, but their heritage language might influence their English as well. And that's gone on over years. So, I mean, if we go back in time to and transport ourselves to Liverpool, the Liverpool accent that many of us are familiar with is a relatively young accent compared with most urban areas, certainly compared with London. And that emerged as a result of mass migration from Ireland and North Wales in the 18th and 19th century. So similar things will have been happening in London. I think what's interesting at the moment is there are very clear patterns emerging. So that those vowels I mentioned, so that window and no, which you hear in exists in a number of other varieties of English. Caribbean English has a monophthong for that vowel. Asian languages have a monophthong for that vowel in their heritage language. So whether that's a transfer from a number of languages that have that pronunciation where London previously hasn't had is having an impact is interesting. And Queen Mary University, where Johanna's based, have done a wonderful project on multicultural London English and explore those roots and those influences. So I think what's great about now is we've got access to data where we can ask those questions and look at it in great detail to see what the influences are and how quickly they come into a language and how long they will stay.
John, that's a fascinating insight, and as I say, not only have I learned some new long words, but I say really understand about the dynamics of language. Johanna, do you want to sort of come in and say, you mentioned there about your great work you're doing on how the London of today speaks. So do you want to share us better? Johnny, do you want to stop sharing, mate? And
I will, yeah, of course.
That'd be great then.
Share a couple of slides.
I think you're a co-host now, Johanna, so you should be okay to.
Yep.
Right, stuff there. So, Johanna, before you begin, just a bit about your background, because say originally from Germany. I mean, what's your story?
Yes, I'm a research fellow at Queen Mary University, but I'm normally based at Kiel University in the north of Germany. And I'm German, but I'm interested in Cockney. I studied English. I have a degree in English, focused on linguistics, and then with my PhD thesis, I focused on social linguistics, on some grammatical variation in British English dialects, and I've sort of stayed on the British Isles research-wise, and found this really interesting new project around London ways of speaking, and in particular, not just how Londoners speak, but actually what my project is about, how Londoners reflect on different London dialects, their attitudes and evaluations of different London dialects. That's my research focus at the moment.
Yeah. So your research involved like talking to a lot of people on the street as such and around and about. Yeah. So I want to tell us a bit more.
Yes, exactly. My research project, my field work that I came here for is I'm doing interviews, my London Talks interviews with Londoners. I don't really approach people in the streets because I want to sit down with them. I want to have a proper conversation and ask them questions such as, what I normally do in my interviews is that I play audio clips of prototypical London voices. And then I ask people questions about those. For example, what would you label this way of speaking? What would you, how do you imagine the speaker to be like? Where would you locate this dialect within Greater London? And sort of just encourage people to reflect on what they're hearing and tell me what they know about London dialects. That's my current research. But what I've prepared for today, because you wanted to focus on the evolution, is a slightly different aspect of my research, because I've also been looking, here in London, I'm talking to Londoners. So I'm collecting Londoners' reflections from them, how they are expressing them. But I've also been looking at sort of reflections, discourses about London dialects throughout history. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, the evolution of Cockney representations in the literature, in the media, in public discourse from a historical perspective. And if that's okay, I'm just going to start.
Yeah, far away, please. Fascinating.
Okay. So the questions that I'm asking is, how are language features of Cockney represented in discourse throughout time? and how are the speakers of Cockney represented in discourse over time. And speakers of a dialect are sometimes also called characterological figures of a dialect. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at, or that's what I want to show you. And we're going to start in the early 19th century. So the first representations of Cockney and Cockney start to appear in the literature in late 18th century pronunciation dictionaries or language guides, some novels as well. And here's a good example from a work by Samuel Pegg, Anecdotes of the English Language, where he gives a humorous exchange which takes place on a ship, and a citizen says, "Oh Lord, missus, my hat and wigs overboard," and the wife replies, "My eye and Betty Martin, and there's a whale." And another passenger says, "A whale? Where? I'd give a £5 note to see a whale." And then the captain says, also Cockney, "There aren't never no whale nowhere, sir. It's a gentleman's mispronunciation, sir. It's his wife's whale, but she wears over her wig, sir, that's all." So here you can see that this is how Cockney was represented at the beginning of the 19th century. It's very different to what we just heard, what Johnny was playing, and also how you would imagine Cockney to be like. But this is how Cockney was represented on the page at the time, and these are the linguistic features. Johnny has already talked about these, which are represented there. One which is called VW interchange, yeah, where we have this where the pun is based on whale. That's what it's based on. Where we have where the W and the V are sort of sounds are interchanged at the beginning of words. WH cluster reduction, that's when WH words used to be, that's actually completely standard now, standard British English, where we don't say where and what, we say where and what. But at the time, this was a Cockney feature. Yeah, so Cockney was innovative in that respect, in that it sort of, had this linguistic feature earlier than the actual British standard pronunciation. And then H dropping has been a long Cockney feature, apparently, dropping your H's. But H insertion was also features not so well known maybe these days, where you insert an H where it's not supposed to be. And these are some representations of Cockneys in the 19th century, yeah? Sort of quite a few Cockney stereotypes. One of them was the Cockney rogue. For example, or epitomized in Charles Dickens' work, The Pickwick Papers. It's his first novel, actually, Charles Dickens' first novel. There was this character of Sam Weller, the boot cleaner who becomes a servant to Mr. Pickwick. And this is him. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you? Doesn't matter. There's a lovely homepage as well by the British Library explaining the Cockney dialect in Dickens' works, and especially also in Pickwick Papers. And then there are some other illustrations that you can see here. Costermongers is also a typical Cockney stereotype. The Coster girl here, she's also characterized by means of some Cockney linguistic features, H dropping, for example. This is too small, you probably can't read it. You can see that some of these characters were properly caricatured, not just depicted, but caricatured. And there's another interesting stereotype which emerged at the beginning of the 19th century, namely the Cockney sportsman. The Cockney sportsman was a citizen from London who had come into some money through his trade or services and could afford a bit of leisure and upper class pastimes such as shooting and horse riding and angling and so on. So he went into the countryside, but he wasn't very good at it. So he was this comical character who just went into the country, wreaked havoc with his gun, not being able to use it properly, and so on. And you can see that this illustration is captioned with this little exchange here, where we can also see these Cockney features. My gun went off quite by accident, and if your nose is spoiled, can't you have a wax one? And then he says, again, VW interchange, wax one indeed. Who wouldn't rather have his own nose than all the wax ones in the world? Okay, And these illustrations are from Robert Seymour. He was had also illustrated some works by Dickens. He was very popular for exactly these characters, the Cockney sportsman. And towards excuse me, towards the end of the 19th century, this representation of Cockney, the VW interchange and this very small set of features was actually seen as outdated. So writers started to change how Cockney was represented on the page. And there was one writer called Andrew Tuer, who was actually a trailblazer in that respect. And George Bernard Shaw, the dramatist, playwright that you probably all know, wrote about Tuer that sometimes in the 80s, in the 1880s, the late Andrew Tuer called attention in the Pall Mall Gazette, a contemporary newspaper, to several peculiarities of modern Cockney and to the obsolescence of the Dickens dialect that was still being copied from book to book by authors who never dreamt of using their ears. And with the Dickens dialect, he means exactly the set of features, VW interchange, H dropping, H insertion, and so on that I've just listed. And here you can see an example from this book by Andrew Tuer. And I give you a second to read this for yourself. But you can see it's much more similar to the Cockney that we know, or what we associate with the Cockney. Just read it and see if you can.
I'm just trying to Google what prigging is.
Yeah. Prigging is snatching, sort of stealing, as far as I know.
All right.
Please correct me. So
yeah,
you can
another
see,
word for a thief, yeah.
Yeah. So you may be sure, and so on. So you see here, there are a lot more features represented here, yeah? Sort of, he was trying to represent Cockney with all of the linguistic detail. He even provides a gloss for non-Cockney speakers to translate it.
Yeah. So you can see like the emerging Cockney stereotype there, can't you?
Yeah, exactly. The modern stereotype. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other was also stereotype, but it was then perceived as outdated from the sort of 1880s onwards.
Yeah.
And representations. Okay. So sorry. This is again a list of these features which were then introduced into the discourse, Cockney features. So H dropping and this WH cluster reduction, they remained, but we also have yaw dropping in, for example, January, was not January, but January, Tuesday, Dooley, or a raised strut vowel. Strut is the short R sound. For example, Monday, that's another one, actually. Oh, no, much, Monday, were like Monday, match, and so on. And most importantly, something that Johnny also mentioned in his overview, the open face vowel. Yeah, so this is the sigh, bias, relation, engaged, and so on, which is sort of very prototypical Cockney feature. And this is also an interesting work, which I've sourced from the British Library, and microfiche, a very old little booklet, also by Tuer, called the Cockney Almanac. And here you can see all sorts of Cockney features represented, but also in particular the ones that I've listed. And let's just briefly look at this paragraph here. I'm going to read it to you, but I'm not going to read it in Cockney. I'm going to read it in my English voice. Somebody says that when I was a little boy, I was taken for a treat into the country, but for the first time, I saw a farmyard, green fields, and heard a cock crow, which in my innocence, having only foreseen horses, I called a cock neigh. This, of course, is a stupid story, but it's what I'm told country people believe. Let's just keep that in this little anecdote in mind. I'm going to come back to it in a second. But first, I wanted to show you some of the representations of Cockneys in the 19th century. And there was especially, so it's not just the representation on the page of pages changed, the Cockney representation on the pages, but also some of the Cockney stereotypes, yeah. And there was especially one character, the Cockney swell. sort of dapper, dandy, fashionable, well-dressed city character, but with a strong Cockney accent. And we can see an illustration here, which is Harry, the Cockney philosopher from the satirical magazine Punch. He had his own Cockney column, if you want, in Punch towards the end of the 19th century. But this Cockney swell was also a character on the music hall stages. Here you can see Champagne Charlie, for example, played by George Leaborn. And these Cockneys, what did I want to say? I don't know. I've lost my lost my thought. But anyway, so this was a sort of a stereotype on the musical stages. And what you can see here is music sheets of musical songs, also sourced from British Library. I spent quite some time in the British Library for this project, where you can see sort of the modern Cockney represented in these lyrics, in these music sheets for the music halls. And here you can see Daisy is again the open face vowel, but also this open flat mouth vowel that is typical of Cockney even today. A bad, houses, a bad, and so on. And TH fronting, Johnny also mentioned that this is the feature where you have instead of Bethnal instead of Bethnal.
It's fascinating because it's all about codification of Cockney. You can see this thing emerging of the Cockney stereotype, can't you?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and I told you I'd come back to this little anecdote because I also wanted to briefly talk about the origins of the term Cockney. Where does the term actually come from? Pegg in 1803 says it's much controverted. Let's just see which theories there are about the origins of the word Cockney. So Greek, oikogenes, born and bred at home, maybe, or coquin, French scoundrel, or Latin coquinarius, via French coquenio, or for belonging in the kitchen, one who loves good eating and drinking, marvelous abode of perpetual youth and good cheer. You can see that some of these stereotypes are sort of also woven into these theories, so into these etymological origins. So not quite sure whether this has not influenced also these definitions. And then, of course, the anecdote that we've heard, that it comes from like this Cockney sportsman character who doesn't know his way around the countryside and thinks that the Cockneys. Other sort of more random etymological origins, that Cockney is the word for a foundling child born in the city, that it's the word for a cog's egg, a small or yolkless egg, or from Romany, cocav, to deceive, swindle, stun, so the Cockney as a swindler, or from the cock-shaped vein on St. Mary Le Beau's belfry. So there are all these different theories, which I thought might be interesting to look at. And moving on into the 20th and 21st century.
Can we get a round boo from the audience at this point here?
Yes, exactly. I think this is something that especially you as people interested in Cockney are much more familiar with. Earlier, sort of early 20th century Cockney representations, stereotypes in My Fair Lady, the musical and film, and Mary Poppins, the film, especially in the character Bird, the chimney sweep. Julie Andrews, who was actually appears in both My Fair Lady and Mary Poppins, so she's like the female Cockney actor at the time. And then we have Alfie, a prominent Michael Caine role where he plays a sort of a bit of a continuation of the Cockney swell, sort of this womanizer who speaks with a Cockney accent. The TV series Till Death Do Us Part with a prominent Cockney character, Alf Garnett. And what I've also been looking at is how Cockney and Cockneys are represented in 20th century or in more recent newspaper discourse. And the character is interesting because the characterological figures or the stereotypes, the stereotypical speakers associated with Cockney is actually the number one that are still sort of called the prototypical Cockney and sort of mentioned in the discourse about Cockney is Dick Van Dyke. And Dick Van Dyke is the actor who played Bert, the chimney sweep. He's actually American and he's not a Cockney at all. And apparently his Cockney accent in the Mary Poppins film was something quite atrocious, something really bad. He didn't do the accent very well. But in the discourse, he is still represented as a Cockney, as a prototypical Cockney, and people speak of the old Dick Van Dyke accent and so on, which is actually a non-thing. It's not even he's not even a real Cockney. And I think when was it, in 2017, he received a BAFTA for his lifetime achievements and actually publicly apologized for this bad Cockney accent in Mary Poppins, but he's influenced the discourse on Cockney, and he's really this Cockney character that people associate with the dialect. But you can see when you go through this list here, who else is a typical Cockney in the 20th century and 21st century? Danny Dyer, Ray Winston, the actors, then Chas Hodges from Chaz and Dave, Harry Redknapp, the football personality, Cray Twins, Barbara Windsor, and other EastEnders, Mickey Flanagan, the comedian, and Alf Garnett. So these are the ones which are mentioned more frequently as typical Cockneys.
Yeah. It's interesting, Barbara Windsor's the only woman in that list. And we had an event this week about inspiring Cockney women. So that's fascinating in the media, that perhaps a media bias to Cockney stereotype, and it's a male Cockney stereotype, perhaps. That's true.
And Only Fools and Horses was mentioned in my interviews quite frequently, not so much in the newspaper discourse that I looked at, but yeah, they were also sort of on people's minds as typical, as what they associate with a Cockney. And concerning the language features in this newspaper discourse that I analyzed, now we don't get representations like from Tuer, where we have sort of Cockney transcriptions, almost phonetic transcriptions of Cockney dialect. And it's Cockney is now mainly referred to in terms of rhyming slang expressions, and not very many rhyming slang expressions, only very few ones which are just recycled all the time, and certain lexical features, certain lexical words like a geezer or core blimey, go blimey. And it's interesting because rhyming slang and also these words didn't really play any role whatsoever in the 19th century discourse about Cockney. Rhyming slang was really like the thieves' language, and it wasn't so much associated with Cockney as a dialect at all. But these days it's different. And Andy, sorry, let me just wrap this up, and then my apologies. Thank you. And yeah, because this is basically almost the end of my little input. I hope you found this interesting. So what we can see is that there is an evolution also in the representation of Cockney dialect and its stereotypical speakers. And Cockney characters have always been prominent, much discussed characterological figures, also in the 19th century. And today, of course, we have, what is a typical Londoner these days? What is a typical London dialect these days? These are questions that I'm trying to get at in my research, and that you all have your personal answer to. But of course, it will be more varied because, as Johnny has already said, there's now different dialects which are also associated with London: estuary English, multicultural London English, and also consequently different characterological figures or stereotypes. Okay, so much for my
fascinating. I want to suggest we're here.
Sorry, I just wanted to draw your attention to my homepage, the londontalksresearch.co.uk, where you can read up more on my project, and also read my blog, my interview blog. I featured Andy and Saif in this blog as well. Maybe some other familiar faces that you associate with Cockney as it's spoken in London at the moment. So yes, that's my part.
Brilliant stuff there. And again, do visit the site. It's fabulous stuff there. I'm just keen if we can bring Tony in, and then we'll then open up the discussion for all the free speakers there. But as I say, that was fantastic, and you're doing a great job, and great for the cause of Cockney culture there. So do you want to come off share there, and we'll then get Tony on the screen.
Hi there. I've unmuted Andy, and what I said.
Sorry, mate. I can hear you, mate. You're okay.
You can hear. I was just going to say, my slide is only a cover of the book, so I don't need to share my slides particularly.
No, thank you, mate. What book's that, Tony? By the way,
this is my novel Foxy Tea, which is what I was going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And these have been really fascinating presentations. Thanks both for those. I really liked that George Bernard Shaw quote about authors using their ears, and I think that's something that I've tried to do in my work very much. And Foxy T was written at the turn of the century. It was written in 1999 and 2000, and it came out in 2003. And I was wanting to write about a novel about the East End of London, and I was getting really a bit bored of all of the. It was that kind of lock, stock, and two smoking barrels kind of moment in British culture where everyone was endlessly fascinated with the Cray twins and with and also with Jack the Ripper. And it seemed to me that in a city like London that's been defined by waves of immigration, where the sedimentation of those successive waves of migration is still visible, particularly in the East End of London, that people were sort of ignoring what was happening on the surface. And it seemed to me that in Stepney, in Whitechapel, where I lived at the time, it was what was happening at street level that was the most interesting thing. And I didn't want to kind of ignore that and write about the Cray twins like everyone else was doing. And the kind of catalyst for the novel, for Foxy T, came about because there was a minicab company on Cannon Street Road where I lived in behind Whitechapel Hospital there, which closed down, and London was changing so fast at that moment that you couldn't tell whether it was going to reopen as a sweatshop, an art gallery, or an internet shop. And in those days before broadband, I was hoping it would be an internet shop. In fact, it stayed empty for about a year. Most of the time that I was writing Foxy T, this building was empty. And at the same time as that, these young women, students, sixth form students at the Mulberry School on Bigland Street, used to kind of hang out and smoke B&H in the stairwell of the building that I lived in. And they'd write their names in felt pen really neatly on the walls, like Naz, Brick Lane Massive, Terror, Jazz, and things. And I thought, at one point, I thought, oh my God, wouldn't it be brilliant if, for the sake of writing the novel, if it was two of these young women in a couple of years were running an internet shop in that building, wouldn't that be something? And at that time, internet shops were really new. The first internet shop opened in London in 1994. And that was called Siberia in Fitzrovia. And but by the time I came to write Foxy T in 1999, internet shops were everywhere around the world. They ditched the coffee and they were just about computers and phones. And but no one had written a novel in an internet shop, which also seemed to be a new kind of social space that had developed in London. And so, but there was also this other thing that was happening in London at the time, which is what in retrospect became known as multicultural London English, out of the work of two linguists, Paul Kurswill and Jenny Cheshire, at the University of Lancaster, with their Linguistic Innovators project of 2004. They, at the beginning of that project, 2004, they were calling it a multiracial vernacular. That was the kind of quote. But by the end of it, 2007, when they started publishing the outputs, they'd coined this term, multicultural London English. But at the time when I was writing, it didn't have a name. It was just this new kind of hybrid language that was borrowing from Cockney, borrowing from Black British language and other kind of dialects, from Jamaican Creole, and it didn't any longer belong to any single community. It was just a new kind of lingua franca in the East End of London, particularly. And I realized that if I was going to represent contemporary Londoners in my novel Foxy T, I'd have to use this new language that didn't have a name, but it meant that if you were traveling on a bus across the East End and you heard someone speaking on the seat behind you, there was no way of determining or understanding or knowing the ethnicity of the speaker. A kind of what was really interesting about multicultural London English was that it no longer belonged to any one community. And also another example, young second generation Sylheti Londoners in Stepney and Cannon Street Road, where I lived, were calling each other Rasta. You know, this was a massive kind of rupture, you know, with the identity politics that had obtained. And I realized that rather than just using that for the dialect in the book, for the dialogue rather in the book, just whenever people speak, it would kind of stigmatize it if I was kind of setting it in a kind of novel that was written otherwise in Queen's English. So the whole novel had to be written in this language. I'll just give you a flavor, this language that I was hearing all around me. And what I was trying to do, I won't try and act this. I won't try and do the kind of those characteristics of the vowel sounds that Johnny and Joanna have been so fascinatingly speaking about. I'm just going to read this as me. And what I tried to do was really listen for the grammar of this kind of new hybrid language, rather than any specific bits of vocabulary, because I thought that if I used vocabulary, it would date more quickly. So I was listening for the grammar. Anyway, this is the opening page. And I will say that the impetus for writing this opening page was that graffiti in the stairwell of my building. The landlords sent the decorators around to paint it over. And I thought, oh my God, I've got to get a photo of this. I can't believe it's being painted over. So I got a disposable camera, ran down to the stairwell, took a photo of these names, this list of names of these kind of sixth form students. And something about the pathos of those names being painted over, that was the kind of spur for starting to write the novel. And it goes like this. I'll just read the page one. They got proper names them too in it, but everyone still call them by their tags, what are everywhere on all them, like stairwell and flats and playground round here, at least where they ain't been wash off yet or paint over. And they are Rugy Babes and Foxy T. Both of them girl work up the easy call phone shop and internet up Cannon Street Road. That is, they switch on all the computer them and log on or whatever, then switch on the network and get them phone meter running. So like at whatever time, you can see who's in like booth number 2 calling Russia or back home wherever and how much it cost. And they make sure there's all the main phone cards in stock in it and they order new ones in when they're running out or whatever. And like switch on the photocopier since man can get them copy there and all. And make sure it's got all paper in it and that. And they probably thought that since the Easy Call is owned by Rugy Babe's uncle, who's been out in Bangladesh or wherever for some little while, that they'll be sorted there for as long as they want in it, because people have always got to get on the internet for their emails and do photocopying or buy phone cards or phone their families to make sure the monies they sent over got there okay and shit like that. Well, all of that's true in it. That's what people have to do every day, especially around here. But if Rugy Babes and Foxy T thought that mean they was sorted, they was wrong, because that ain't the way it work out, seen. That's just a little bit of page one to give you a flavor, and just wondered if there's anything else I can say about it. But it seemed to me the whole novel needed to be written in that voice, so that it wasn't kind of continuing the sort of piss-takey kind of attitude of like the Ali G character or something like that. It was something that needed to be taken seriously, treated with respect. And with, you know, as humanely and respectfully as I could to write the novel.
Well, it's 20 years on, Tony. I mean, if you were to rewrite that today, would it be a different novel, different language, you think, or would it? Is that sort of captured? I think
if it came out now, it would not be such a surprise to people. It took people by surprise a little bit when it came out. People weren't sure how to take it because people hadn't quite got used to this language. We're more used to it now, so it might be less of a surprise. I think odd little items of vocabulary might change, but the kind of grammatical structures would probably be fairly similar. I would think. Yeah, that's a good question.
No problem. So listen, I'm just going to do a couple of quick announcements before we go. So I know Joanna's got to get off shortly, so bear with me a moment. Just a couple of quick announcements, and then what I would love to do is to really throw it open to the floor in terms of we've got an event next Wednesday at Tower Hamlets Council. discussing about recognising Cockney as a community language. So we're encouraging people to come along and hopefully celebrate an historical moment. Next Thursday, we've got a great pie and mash debate with 4 speakers and a resident poet, Tim Wells, speaking now on about the great, is it dying, surviving or thriving? And then following on that, for a further bit about sociolinguists, we touched upon there about the issue of what's called multicultural English. Again, if you're interested in the language side of things, on Monday the 20th. We've got our exhibition, our virtual exhibition of the story of Cockney going live at Toynbee Hall, a virtual projection of our exhibition. And then a fabulous event at the Royal Society of Arts, Invisible Discrimination, Jews, Ageism and Cockneys, about the issues of discrimination in the country. Also issue about social class bias, a live event on Tuesday, March the 28th in Whitechapel. Current East End struggles, another online debate on the 30th, and finishing with a typical Cockney way with a good laugh with the legendary Arthur Smith comedian join us, Dr. Mary Owen, and the lovely Tom Carradine on the piano, on pardon the pun on the Joanna there. But I stopped the share there because I'm anxious, because I think there's some fabulous speakers there from Johnny, Joanna, and Tony there, and just wanted interesting dimensions there. Any thoughts about this subject of Cockney evolving? Is it dying? Any thoughts there about what people have heard there? I've certainly learned a lot of new long words as well as some fresh insights into the subject. Anyone want to put their hand up or unmute to speak? Peru, how are you doing? Safe, can you do the unmuting, mate? And
yeah, I've done it myself. Yeah, all right.
Good for you, mate. What a bloody Cockney. Come in here, unmute yourself. I don't know what's going on.
Self-help, isn't it? That's what it is. It's all about. And I just want to say thank you to the speakers, because I come from a linguistic background myself. I studied Middle Eastern languages, literature, and Arabic at SOAS. So, and then obviously I use those skills as a counsellor in Tower Hamlets. And one of the things I just want to ask the question is there a distinction between an oral Cockney language and a literate one? And have the speakers picked up the changes within that? And what I want to highlight what's happened in the East End is the grime scene, which is music scene, which uses a lot of lyrics, which is based in E3 and E14 postcodes, and that's taken London and the country by storm. And have the speakers picked up on that, or that development, and what do they think of that? But just that distinction between an oral and a literate Cockney culture, and the development, the constant change within that.
Could I come in on that? That's a really interesting question and area. And for me, what's particularly interesting about grime is and drill music as well, particularly, is a kind of freedom of speech issue. This initially came to focus when the riots happened in 2011, and there was a sort of, you could have made a case study out of this. Young Asian and Black British men and white working class men using Facebook to post satirically about the riots that were happening were arrested for inciting riot and convicted, many of them, and more recently, and for saying basically what you could have, a middle-class speaker could have written a letter to the Guardian and not been arrested for inciting riot. There's no difference in the content of their utterances. And with grime and drill music in particular, there's a freedom of speech issue where lyrics and a kind of the freedom of expression of young men, particularly making drill music, the lyrics and their kind of self-expression is used in evidence and used as evidence of law breaking, even where there's no other evidence. And young people are being convicted for writing about kind of social justice issues through the medium of drill music, and then being arrested for it. There's a big freedom of expression issue playing out at the moment, and it's not. I'm not seeing organizations that, you know, that like Index and English Pen necessarily addressing this yet.
Johnny, or any points you want to come in on?
No, in terms of the literary tradition, Tony's better placed to speak, and likewise Johanna's researched in that area. I'm principally focused my research on spoken English, but what I think is interesting, and it's not necessarily grime or drill, but popular music, including grime, drill, hip hop, all sorts of variants. The vocabulary that is represented there and is widely used by young speakers, it's interesting. So I use a Loyal Kana song with sixth form groups that I do and ask them to pick out bits of things that they feel are representative of London English. And there's a clip I use of about 15-20 seconds. Loyal Kana's from Croydon, so not East London, but South London. And there's a half a dozen words in there that they immediately pick up on as kind of vocabulary that they use. And it's interesting when you track things like dictionary entries. So this is just kind of tracking language. So for instance, the term bear, as in lots of, many, there were bear people at that concert last night. It's it's bear hot, it's very. That first emerges, according to Green. Jonathan Green is a wonderful slang lexicographer. Free website, Green's Dictionary of Slang. He dates it, I think, to the early 2000s, and the second citation of bear in Green's Dictionary of Slang is Dizzy Rascal. And so, yeah, just to say, so things like popular music, popular culture, there are serious linguists tracking that, and they are getting into dictionaries and being picked up by Tony mentioned the Queen Mary and the Lancaster University Multicultural London English Research. So I think there is from a linguist point of view, there is a lot of academic interest in it, and it is being tracked and monitored and hopefully celebrated and promoted, etc.
There's a great there's a professor of urban literature at Queen Mary, Nadia Valman, who people should look out for as well. Someone's got their hand up, I see.
Yeah. So Nick, do you want to come in now?
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about popular culture, because I'm an artist and a musician, and I sing in my own accent, and my work really does kind of cover that intersection between working class struggle and, you know, being someone who's looking at cant songs, at slang in popular culture. So I just wanted to let people know that, really. And the project's called Stick in the Wheel.
Yeah.
And we have a show at King's Place in April.
It's fascinating. Why do you think you had to make a conscious decision, like almost like an assertion, to do it rather than something maybe that just come natural?
Because I think I was really interested in making sort of authentic work, and to be authentic, I had to be who I am, which is this, right? So it made sense to me. And growing up in East London, you know, it's part of my culture, all this kind of being a Cockney, essentially. You know, and I think go on.
But do you think other like mainstream performers have to sort of go through that process of saying, well, I've got to assert this, you know? And I found it fascinating that, you know, it's brilliant that you're doing it, and maybe an indictment of our era and culture that somehow you've got to feel you've consciously got to do it rather than like flow. I don't know, Tony, any thoughts on that, mate?
I was going to say, Nick, could you put the link into the chat so we can kind of all click in there? I found when I took the book off the shelf this morning, a piece by Michael Moorcock, who's a great London writer, very knowledgeable about kind of literatures in different London voices. And he wrote this. This is just a general point. Constantly invigorated by successive waves of immigrants, London produces a literature unrivaled by any great city. She's a powerhouse of fiction, using whole cultures for fuel. London erupts with street language to match the tenor of the times, drawing vitality from the word hordes of the powerless and disenfranchised. Working novelists, usually too poor to live anywhere but the ghettos, listen and take notes. And then it says, spontaneously created, the new language has soon become a strategy against authority, ultimately responding to general experience and achieving a level of expression useful to all. That's a really interesting kind of point about how language, becomes kind of used in literatures and used by disenfranchised communities and kind of mainstreamed. I just thought I'd draw people's attention to Michael Moorcock.
Brilliant, and that is phenomenal, and that was absolutely music to my ears. And I think, why is that the first time in my life? I'm 64 years old, passionate about London culture and that's the first time I've heard that. And
oh, good. There's a book. Michael Moorcock. He's a great novelist. There's a brilliant novel called Mother London. People might know. It's absolutely stunning book. But there's a collection of his non-fiction which is called London Peculiar, and it's writing about kind of all aspects of kind of London literatures.
Going back to the Google graph at the beginning, like 1820, Cockney culture was there, like dominating the national scene, and somehow or other, as I say, there's almost a subjugation going on about sort of suppressing these voices, whether it's formally, legally, like you're saying, about in riots, and the fact that Nick, a brilliant person, has got to double up to get to assert himself. Nick, what are you going to say there?
Well, I was going to say, like, some of the material that I've been looking at from around the 1800s is it's mostly parodies of Cockney stuff written by middle class people, and you sort of it's really nice to be able to reclaim that sort of thing, to be honest. But it's so, like, it is, when you see that engram, it's a little bit not disingenuous, but like not entirely accurate, because I don't know, I've not heard of those Cockney poets, so I'm going to look that up. But like, definitely get a sense that it's not Cockneys doing the mentioning.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, what I'll suggest, though, is it's like the old Oscar Wilde quote, one thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And it just strikes me the point Tony was making there, that those like injustices about people, because the language and culture of these people, these sections of our community, are not being talked about at all, not even being parodied fully, So, so as I say, I think some great points there. Anyone else want to sort of share?
I've got it.
I've just noticed a few. Noticed if Miriam had put a question into the chat, which was, how much did early viewing of TV influence the dialects of EastEnders? Let's probably start with Johnny with that one, if he's still there. I can't hear you.
Yes. Yeah,
oh, sorry.
I've unmuted and then remuted myself, but I'm back, I think. I briefly mentioned earlier, didn't I? I think that the media obviously has an impact on all aspects of language, the language that we hear around us and that we are aware of, and sometimes we adopt, but it's face-to-face communication that's the most important in terms of pronunciation. I think it's interesting, the EastEnders thing. Obviously it's scripted, it's representational. Similar things have been said of, is Coronation Street representative of Manchester? Absolutely not. And yet there's a hint there of certain aspects we might all recognize about a big northern city. So I think it's a two-way process, isn't it? Does EastEnders, the program, kind of reflect London life, or does it influence people's perceptions of London life? It's a difficult one to answer, but certainly the actual changes that have happened in London and influences on London English are very much more from the people themselves, and in face-to-face communication, and in things like migration patterns. And Amanda Cole speaks very, very well, doesn't they? That question, one of the questions you've asked a few times today, Andy, is Cockney dying? There's quite a bit of coverage recently, wasn't there, about Amanda Cole's research at the University of Essex, and this notion that it isn't dying anyway, but if anybody thinks it is dying, then go to certain parts of Essex, and what you might think of as Cockney is very well represented there in the voices you hear, because of a lot of a certain generation of East End Londoners moved out to Essex, and obviously their language went with them, so it continues in a different form in different parts. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I think the media has an influence, but it's sometimes exaggerated quite how big that impact is on change and speed of change.
Can I just add a point? I mean, I live on Barry Island. I'm a real life Gavin and Stacey on the BBC show where you got an East End boy who marries a Barry girl, lives on Barry Island and stuff. And I actually think one observation about that show, it transformed Barry's the culture within Barry, because previously Barry had a lot of learned sort of deprivation in terms of putting themselves down, and it actually gave people a fresh pride. And you know, we're from Barry Island, Gavin and Stacey, and I just wonder whether like shows like EastEnders actually do provide a prop for an unconscious self-belief. I know the West Ham fans used to do the EastEnders theme at time at matches and so on. So I just wondered that there is a sort of contribution to the culture in terms of a self-confidence and a self. And certainly one of the things I'd like to see for next year's festival is a Cockney Kids Festival, and where maybe we get Cockney nursery rhymes, Cockney stories, almost like Cockney Nori underway, because my grandkids went to see Puss in Boots film, and they go away and say, why does a baddie talk like Grandad? And you know, they don't hear alternative voices, and I just think hopefully we're making some small effort here. But you know, don't any thoughts about that, Tony?
Well, I wanted to come back to this. I'm still stuck on the kind of Cockney poets thing that you just brought up.
Yeah.
What it reminded me of, and maybe this is something for next year. There was a great project as an East London artist called Chris Dawley Brown. He's a photographer. He's been a photographer for the last 50 years, and he did a residency in the BBC archives, where he looked up everything in the BBC archives that bore the tag East End or E1, and he pulled up all these incredible documentaries from the 1950s and 60s that were shown once and have never been seen again. You know. One of them was the first or second open door access TV show, which was done by the Basement Film Group, who used to be on Cable Street, it was young men who were given training how to use cameras, and they made their own TV show about life in the East End right now, and that currently is on show at Raven Row Gallery. Near Bishopsgate, if people want to go and see that, Raven Row. One of the other films that came up was a film called Belonging, and it's not available online as far as I know, but Chris has a copy of it that he got from the archives, and it was shot in about 1963 in Stepney and Whitechapel, and it follows the lives of three EastEnders. One is Herbert Stencil, the Yiddish poet and newspaper publisher. It's him writing his paper and selling it in Whitechapel Market. Then there's another Cockney poet called Johnny Quarrel, who was a dock worker who lived in Stepney, and it's him talking about being a poet in the 60s, and he reads his poetry there's a pub in Bethnal Green that had jazz nights and poetry nights upstairs in 1963, and it's footage of him reading his poem. And then there's another artist whose name I can't remember, but as a young man with a young family in a tower block in Stepney. It's a really, really fascinating film. I'll give you a link to that, Andy, if I
please
afterwards.
I think
it's called Belonging.
Tony.
Keep an eye out for it.
There's a wealth of stuff out there, but
it really
there's not enough opportunities, not enough platforms, stages. So hopefully this can be a trigger, a call for more things, and certainly for next year, some essential stuff. What I'm going to say.